Anne's House of Dreams. Chapter 1. Bestie. Anne Shirley is officially slamming her Euclid geometry book into a chest because she's done teaching and is living that main character bride-to-be life up in the Green Gables garret, catching up with her day-one ride-or-die best friend Diana Wright, who low-key grew up into a full-on mom holding her 2-year-old baby girl named Small Anne Cordelia. They're gossiping about everything from the brand new telephone shaking up Avonlea to Anne moving 60 miles away to Four Winds Harbor to marry her forever fave Gilbert Blythe, completely acknowledging how fast time flies while marveling at their adult glow-ups. Chapter 2. Green Gables is literally in a chokehold of wedding hype as Marilla and the iconic gossip queen Mrs. Rachel Lynde trade lore about old memories and prep gifts, like apple leaf spreads and braided rugs, right before some of Anne's old acquaintances. Specifically Jane Andrews, who stayed sweet despite marrying into wealth, and the delightfully shady Mrs. Jasper Bell, pull up to serve some passive-aggressive comments about Anne's trousseau and Gilbert's career. Luckily, the hater energy gets completely cleared out when Gilbert arrives to take Anne on a romantic walk through the birches, casually dropping the major news that he secured their dream home, a cozy white house by the harbor left behind by the late Miss Elizabeth Russell, complete with trees, a brook, and epic sunset views. Chapter 3. Anne finalizes her ultra-exclusive guest list with Mrs. Rachel and Marilla, stressing over who makes the cut while shouting out icons like Mr. Harrison, Miss Lavender, and a totally glowed-up 19-year-old poet, Paul Irving, who drops absolute bars. We're also introduced to new returning squad members, like Charlotta IV, who hilariously serves chaotic married life lore about her Yankee bricklayer husband Tom, and how her wedding vows still low-key stress her out, alongside Philippa Phil and her husband the Reverend Joe pulling up with an elite wedding gift from Miss Patty and Miss Maria at Patty's Place. The legendary iconic China dogs Gog and Magog. Amidst all the wholesome pre-wedding chaos, Anne takes a main character emotional detour for a solo sunset walk to Matthew's grave to process her final night as an unmarried girl, running into Gilbert by the gate to lock in their pearl ring aesthetic and confirm their hype for tomorrow. Chapter 4. It's giving wedding day, and the entire Green Gables compound is in an absolute frenzy as Diana, Davy, Dora, Marilla, and Mrs. Rachel pull through to help Anne get ready. Anne officially steps down the stairs serving supreme bridal elegance in her veil and roses, and they hold an aesthetic, sun-soaked ceremony right in the Green Gables orchard, officiated by Mr. Allen, complete with a random bird singing banger notes, Paul capturing the poetry, and Charlotta and Mr. Harrison hyping them up in the crowd. Marilla gets in her feels watching Anne drive off into the sunset with Gilbert via train to start their next era. Chapter 5. Anne and Gilbert pull up to Four Winds Harbor via horse and buggy, taking in breathtaking, cinematic views of the rose and silver water, the distant lighthouse, and the cozy village vibe. Along the way, they spot a aggressively green house and encounter a brand new, stunning, local girl driving snow-white geese with wheat blonde braids, piercing blue eyes, and a fiercely hostile stare that screams main character mystery. Finally, they roll up to their actual dream home, a cozy seashell white cottage nestled by the harbor, surrounded by spooky aesthetic fir woods and poplars, with a warm fireplace greeting them inside. Chapter 6. Old Dr. Dave and his iconic wife pull up to the cottage with Captain Jim, aka Captain Boyd, a weathered, big-hearted lighthouse keeper who low-key sacrifices his entire dinner steak to feed a random stray dog with a hurt paw, before dropping spicy neighborhood lore about the rival over-harbor McAllister clans and Miss Cornelia Bryant, a fierce, man-hating local icon with a golden heart who despises Methodists. Chapter 7. Captain Jim serves elite historical lore about the house's original residents, detailing how a 60-year-old schoolmaster named John Selwyn used a mysterious psychic transvision to predict his fiancée Hay Persis Lee surviving an intense 8-week delayed storm voyage on the historic ship Royal William to finally arrive in Four Winds and get married right by that exact hearth. Chapter 8. That glorious September at Four Winds Harbor brings unbroken honeymoon bliss for Anne and Gilbert, packed with shore strolls, sailing, and a cozy routine in their house of dreams, where the romantic pull of the sea constantly calls to Anne's imagination. After Gilbert returns from a successful, nerve-wracking night saving a patient's life from the brink of death, a visitor arrives at their lane, Miss Cornelia Bryant. Sporting a chocolate print wrapper covered in pink roses and a striped blue and white apron, Miss Cornelia is an independent, no-nonsense local icon who holds a legendary comical disdain for men and Methodists, while possessing the golden heart required to sew an exquisite dress for an unloved 8th baby in the Glen. Over tea, Miss Cornelia drops hilarious town gossip about infidel churchgoers, dull Presbyterian ministers, and historical neighborhood eccentrics, like the late Mrs. Roderick Milgrave, whose nephew famously believed he was dead, all while proving she belongs entirely to the exclusive race that knows Joseph, as she and Anne instantly bond over their shared wit and spirit. Chapter 9. Anne and Gilbert finally touch grass and hike down to the Four Winds Lighthouse to hang with Captain Jim, running into an absolute main quest NPC on the way named Marshall Elliott, a legendary local who looks like a literal medieval wizard because he rage-vowed 15 years ago never to shave or cut his hair until his political party actually wins an election, before getting the ultimate VIP treatment at the lighthouse featuring god-tier spiced tea, wholesome lore about Captain Jim's orange cat sidekick named First Mate who was rescued from a cruel fate, and a bunch of wild seafaring throwback stories that low-key cement the captain as an absolute Sigma hero, all of which transitions smoothly into Chapter 10, where Anne goes on a solo side quest for a post-storm beach walk on the rocky shore, and finally bumps into her stunning, hyper-elusive neighbor, Leslie Moore, a drop-dead gorgeous 28-year-old married woman living in the dreary gray house up the brook who rocks a red silk girdle and carries heavy emotional baggage from getting locked into marriage at just 16 years old. And after an initial awkward vibe check where Leslie acts super guarded and defensive, they eventually bond over the chaotic beauty of Bryn's post-storm ocean waves before Leslie gives a slightly reluctant, mysterious invite for Anne to come visit her place. Chapter 11. Miss Cornelia spills all the tragic lore about local legend Leslie Moore, detailing her cursed family history starting with her little brother Kenneth getting crushed by a hay wagon, her dad Frank hanging himself in the parlor on his wedding anniversary, and her getting strong-armed into a toxic marriage with deadbeat Dick Moore by her whining mom Rose to save their mortgaged farm. Before Dick completely vanished on a sea voyage to Havana and got dragged back years later by Captain Jim as a brain-dead, fat, vacant NPC after a mysterious brutal beating. Chapter 12. Leslie finally pulls up to the House of Dreams on a crisp October night after Captain Jim literally shoves her out the door, instantly melting under the wholesome vibe check of fireplace fudge and books, while glowing like an absolute goddess with her golden hair and sea blue eyes, though she abruptly rage quits and bolts home at 10 p.m. after realizing what normal, happy youth looks like compared to her own tragic life. Chapter 13. Anne walks through a dense, spooky fog to visit Leslie, accidentally walking in on Leslie having a massive, heartbreaking crying fit at her table with her loyal dog. Anne slips away and meets Captain Jim, who is escorting a vacant fat Dick Moore home, and they discuss the heavy emotional baggage of the local residents and the eerie ghosts of the foggy night. Chapter 14. As harsh November storms roll in, Anne and Gilbert frequently hang out at the lighthouse with Captain Jim, where Leslie occasionally joins them and dazzles everyone with her wit and beauty, prompting Gilbert to tease Anne about her old crush on Roy Gardner. Chapter 15. Marilla, Mrs. Rachel, and the twins visit for Christmas, leading to a hilarious dinner where Captain Jim and Miss Cornelia endlessly roast each other about church politics, local gossips, and awful husbands, while Gilbert successfully carves the geese to perfection. Chapter 16. Okay, besties. So the vibe is literally freezing because the harbor is completely iced over, and Anne, Leslie, and Gilbert trek over to the Four Winds Lighthouse to kick it with Captain Jim for New Year's Eve. Right when the sun dips, they spot Venus looking gorgeously unhinged in the sky, and Loki witness its ultra-rare, spooky shadow shimmering across the snow, which local lore claims means your biggest life wish is about to drop. They end up sharing the lighthouse with a brand new chaotic character named Marshall Elliott, a total lit, long-haired, eccentric storyteller king who vibes instantly with Captain Jim. Meanwhile, Captain Jim's tiny nephew Joe is knocked out cold on the sofa alongside his iconic golden cat, the First Mate, dropping wild, unhinged toddler quotes about fighting off imaginary wolves that shoot God. The night gets even more cinematic when Captain Jim whips out his fiddle and Marshall drags Leslie onto the floor for an absolute masterclass in traditional dancing, making Leslie look like a radiant Viking queen completely possessed by Quicksilver energy. They count down the final seconds of the year while Captain Jim opens the door to officially let the new era in with zero regrets. Chapter 17. Winter locks down hard with massive snowdrifts, and while everyone is ice skating and snowshoeing, Anne is low-key struggling with a massive emotional wall coming from Leslie. Even though they are tight besties, Anne feels this weird, lingering shade of resentment and low-key hostility from Leslie, prompting a deep dive chat with Captain Jim, who breaks down how Leslie's absolute trauma-filled life makes her ultra-guarded compared to Anne's sunshine upbringing. Despite the awkward tension, Leslie eventually drops off a historically gorgeous hand-stitched baby dress, packed with high-end lace as a secret gift for Anne's upcoming arrival, completely melting away the drama. Captain Jim also flexes his legendary leather-bound life book, filled with wild adventure lore that he wrote for little Joe, though Anne realizes writing it out properly would take an elite tier of psychological talent, prompting her to try and summon her old pen pal Paul, who sadly has to ghost because he's moving across the globe for art school. Chapter 18. Spring finally rolls around, bringing major main character energy with emerald woods, baby leaves, and a totally thought-out harbor. Captain Jim pulls up to Anne's House of Dreams to gift her a load of rustic seashell borders for her flower beds, plus a nostalgic bundle of sweet grass that smells like ultimate motherly comfort. Later on, Miss Cornelia and Captain Jim pull up for a chaotic double feature visit, roasting local town gossip and debating theology, specifically throwing shade at a local heretic named Mr. Howard, who is too smart for his own good. Captain Jim wraps up the evening talking about trashy romance novels and dropping hilarious takes on local town drama, right before Miss Cornelia casually explodes the room by exposing a brand new neighborhood scandal about a local guy named Billy Booth who literally went psycho and burned his wife's expensive $25 Charlottetown broadcloth suit just because other men looked at her too much at church. Chapter 19. Besties. Early June brings major cottagecore aesthetic with pink wild roses and apple blossoms, and Marilla rolls up to the little house with a legendary half-century-old brass-nailed trunk. At first, Susan Baker, the hyper-loyal icon who worships Anne, is low-key salty, but she quickly realizes Marilla is chill and knows her place. Tragedy strikes when Anne goes into labor during a stunning sunset, complete with Dr. Dave and a nurse rushing over, while everyone panics outside. At dawn, after an agonizing night, joy arrives, but absolute heartbreak hits when Gilbert realizes the sweet baby's tiny heart cannot survive. Miss Cornelia gently dresses the baby in Leslie's handmade dress, and they lay little Joy to rest in the harbor graveyard. Anne is totally wrecked and struggles with grief, feeling alienated by tone-deaf well-wishes from friends like Phil Blake. Though Marilla, Captain Jim, and Leslie rally around her to help her survive the dark days. Chapter 20. Anne slowly starts re-entering society, taking a drive down to the point where Captain Jim comforts her by sharing the ultra-tragic 50-year lore of his lost first love, Margaret, a local girl who drifted out to sea in a dory during a sudden thundersquall and vanished forever. Captain Jim explains how he has stayed fiercely faithful to her memory for half a century, finding her spirit in the silvery mists and white birches, and makes Anne promise to keep her memory alive so she is never forgotten. Chapter 21. In a massive emotional plot twist, Leslie breaks down by the brook and confesses to Anne that she low-key hated her out of pure, burning envy all winter, because Anne had everything she ever wanted: love, a cozy home, and a bright future. While she was trapped in her nightmare marriage to Dick, Anne is completely unfazed and validating, revealing she already sensed the tension, which completely shatters the emotional wall between them. Leslie opens up about her brutal childhood trauma, her brother Kenneth's horrific accident, and why she sacrificed her life to marry Dick for her mother's sake. With all the dark secrets out in the open, the toxic barrier completely vanishes, transforming them into ride-or-die besties forever. Chapter 22. Gilbert insists that Susan should stay at the little house for the summer, despite Anne's initial protests about wanting to manage the home alone. Susan enthusiastically takes charge of the pantry and brings up breakfast, sparking a debate about Miss Cornelia Bryant's infamous opinions on men and marriage. Soon after, Miss Cornelia drops in for cherry pie and trades witty remarks with Captain Jim regarding the local Gilman boys stealing her cherries. Miss Cornelia mentions she has received a letter from a Mrs. Daly in Toronto asking her to take in a boarder named Owen Ford, a newspaperman and the grandson of the schoolmaster who originally built Anne's house. Because Miss Cornelia is leaving to attend a WFMS convention in Kingsport alongside Tom Holt's overworked wife, she arranges for Leslie Moore to take the boarder instead. Leslie happily accepts to earn money for roof repairs, while Dr. Dave remains suspiciously jealous of Dr. Gilbert Blythe's growing medical reputation across the harbor. Chapter 23. Owen Ford arrives at the little house via Miss Cornelia, and is instantly recognized by Anne as extremely handsome, possessing strikingly well-shaped ears and a warm, engaging smile. He expresses an immediate sense of belonging, noting that his mother, Alice Selwyn, was born in the very same house and often shared memories of it. Anne walks him over to Leslie's house across a daisy-strewn field during a gorgeous sunset. When Leslie steps out into the warm, golden light of the doorway, wearing a crimson girdle and cream voile dress, Owen is utterly mesmerized, mistaking her breathtaking presence for a sea queen and reacting with stunned admiration before being installed as her boarder. Chapter 24. Anne keeps her newly formed literary idea a secret from Gilbert while he enjoys Susan's cherry pie. A couple of nights later, Anne takes Owen down to Four Winds Point to introduce him to Captain Jim, who has just returned from breaking the news of approaching death to his old crony Henry Pollock. Upon learning that Owen is the grandson of Persis Selwyn, Captain Jim is overjoyed and instantly welcomes him like family, recalling how he used to dandle his mother on his knee. Captain Jim shares a flurry of colorful maritime tales, culminating in lending his prized lifebook, a handwritten record of his adventures, to Owen, who becomes completely enthralled by its pages while walking home under a mackerel sky. Chapter 25. Owen Ford visits the little house to eagerly ask if Captain Jim would allow him to weave the old man's maritime tales into a great Canadian novel, using the lore of Lost Margaret as a romantic thread. Captain Jim is deeply moved and ecstatic to finally have his lifebook written by his dear old friend's grandson. Owen establishes his writing workshop in the lighthouse, collaborating closely with Captain Jim while keeping the manuscript under wraps. Meanwhile, the summer overflows with delightful outings, boating, clam bakes, and strawberry picking, deepening their friendships while Leslie blossoms with a radiant, joyful energy that secretly inspires Owen's literary heroine. As September brings a chilly nip to the air, Owen finishes the manuscript and announces his departure. Chapter 26. While Gilbert is away attending to a serious accident at the Glen, Owen confesses to Anne by the garden brook that he is deeply and desperately in love with Leslie. He is tormented by the realization that she is trapped in a tragic marriage and that he must leave her forever in silence. Anne is stunned by the revelation and aches with profound compassion for both of them, though she manages to maintain composure. After Owen departs the next morning, Leslie isolates herself, leaving Anne deeply concerned about her friend's heartbreak. Chapter 27. While Gilbert is away on a medical call across the channel, Anne wanders alone through the misty, moonlit sandbar, where she encounters a restless and distressed Leslie. Leslie confesses that she has fallen hopelessly in love with Owen and is devastated by his sudden, cold departure, agonizing over whether he noticed her feelings. Though tightly bound by the promise she made to keep Owen's confidence, Anne offers gentle, validating comfort. Shortly after, Gilbert returns with the boat, and they safely escort Leslie home. Chapter 28. Oh, period. Miss Cornelia is literally serving major unhinged gossip realness while reading the local obituaries like her morning TikTok scroll, finding the absolute most unhinged, delusional poetry about old Peter Stimson, who everyone secretly wanted 6 feet under for 30 entire years. Meanwhile, Anne is low-key traumatized by the word relict and how death terminology sounds like an absolute cursed cannibal feast. While Miss Cornelia drops the ultimate lore about a shady evangelist named Fisk, who was totally giving undercover Methodist while pretending to be a Presbyterian, not even knowing how to spell it, and harassing people's souls until poor overworked 10-year-old Ike Baker accidentally wakes up from a deep sleep, leading Fisk to scream, another soul saved like a total clout chaser. The drama escalates when poor Rose Douglas gets so triggered by one of Fisk's unhinged billboards, "Whither goest thou? To heaven or hell?" painted by Henry Hammond, that she literally faints, forcing her husband Charlie to cancel the revival entirely, or the whole Douglas family would walk out of the church. Anne then drops the news that Owen Ford sent his regards, causing Miss Cornelia to go completely feral and cancel him forever, because she knows he left poor Leslie heartbroken and ghosted her like a toxic situationship. Later, Leslie's old dog Carlo, who was literally her emotional support animal and only loyal companion since the dawn of time, tragically passes away right in front of her fireplace after giving her one last soulful look, leaving Leslie completely devastated. To top it all off, Captain Jim gets a letter saying Owen's lifebook is finally getting published next fall, and Miss Cornelia rolls her eyes so hard she nearly loops her vision, insisting there are already way too many published books clogging up the universe. Chapter 29. Gilbert is literally sitting around playing armchair neurologist while watching a lone crow fly across the dead March landscape, suddenly deciding he wants to play mad scientist with Dick Moore's brain. He drops the bombshell that if they take Dick to a hospital and drill some holes into his skull via trephining, his memory might magically come back, completely ignoring the fact that this would ruin Leslie's entire life by turning her back into an unwilling caretaker for a guy she doesn't even love. Anne instantly goes into protective bestie mode, screaming that Gilbert is completely out of his mind and demanding he leave well enough alone. But Gilbert's classic blithe stubbornness kicks in as he insists that doctor ethics mean he has to prioritize a patient's brain over everything else, regardless of the emotional damage. Anne fires back that he's totally meddling where he has no business, citing Uncle Dave's wisdom, and even accuses modern doctors of being way too obsessed with slicing and dicing human flesh like unhinged surgeons. They have their very first actual fight, with Gilbert getting all stiff and huffy, forcing Anne to chase after him and apologize profusely just so he doesn't stay mad, though she refuses to back down on how diabolically unfair this whole situation is for Leslie. Gilbert hits her with a heavy Tennyson quote about following right in the scorn of consequence, and Anne counters by mocking his poetry obsession before laughing at herself because she literally sounds just like Miss Cornelia hating on men. Chapter 30. Gilbert gets totally swamped by a viral flu outbreak at the Glen, giving Anne a brief window of hope that he's completely dropped his unhinged brain surgery plot. But nope, the drama refuses to stay dead. They walk down to the lighthouse to visit Captain Jim past gorgeous fields where local boys are burning dry sandhill grass like an epic sunset aesthetic. But the vibe is super tense and awkward because Anne is still low-key salty at Gilbert. To Anne's absolute shock and betrayal, Captain Jim actually agrees with Gilbert that Leslie deserves to know there's a chance for Dick, arguing that they have to steer by the compass of absolute duty rather than personal feelings, leaving Anne completely defeated. Gilbert finally goes up the brook to drop the life-altering news on Leslie, and after a few days of processing the absolute psychological horror of this choice, Leslie comes down to the little house to announce her final verdict. She's taking Dick to Montreal for the operation, completely freezing over her emotions into a cold, businesslike mask of pure survival mode. Anne is left heartbroken and terrified that if the surgery actually works, Leslie will retreat into the deepest, most unreachable parts of her soul forever, while Gilbert stands firm on his preachiness about modern society's curse being the constant avoidance of responsibility. Chapter 31. Leslie goes into absolute productivity mode, speeding through her house cleaning with Miss Cornelia's backup before packing off to Montreal with Gilbert for Dick's sketchy brain surgery, while leaving behind an icy, polite barrier that totally shuts out all the old jokes and comfort from the little house. Miss Cornelia casually drops the lore that Leslie is funding this whole ordeal by taking out a mortgage on her farm with Captain Jim, who low-key admits he has no kids and wants to help her out secretly, while also venting about how absolute trash Dick was right before leaving, literally chasing ducks until they dropped and trying to swan dive down the well. After a nail-biting wait, Anne gets a letter from Leslie confirming the surgery was a clinical success, though everyone is left stressing over whether his actual memory will ever return. But the plot totally shatters when Anne gets another letter later in May and runs outside, completely dazed and screaming with tea-spilling realization. The man everyone thought was Dick Moore for 12 whole years is actually his look-alike Nova Scotia cousin George Moore, because the real Dick actually died of yellow fever in Cuba a baker's dozen years ago. Chapter 32. Miss Cornelia drops by looking like she just got hit by a truck because she is so utterly kerflummoxed by the plot twist that Dick Moore isn't actually Dick Moore, yelling just like a man as she tries to process the fact that George Moore and Dick were double cousins with identical faces, one blue and one hazel eye, and a history of pulling chaotic twin pranks. She realizes that George's memory loss from his accident and subsequent silence made everyone assume he was just a beat-down, lumpish Dick, meaning poor Leslie literally wasted the best years of her life nursing a random cousin who had zero legal or marital claim on her. Miss Cornelia low-key panics over her own karma for praying the surgery wouldn't work, while Anne starts secretly wondering if this means Owen Ford can finally slide back into the picture, now that Leslie is legally, officially, and completely free from her tragic marriage. Chapter 33. Leslie rolls back into Four Winds all alone in the June twilight, rocking up to Anne's garden like an absolute ghost to explain how George Moore's sister came to Montreal and took him home after he finally remembered his own name and screamed, "Who are you?" upon seeing Leslie for the first time. Leslie admits she feels totally numb, stunned, and weirdly lonely without her routine of caring for him. Comparing her past life to a cage of torture and confessing, she even felt a strange, pitying fondness for Dick, because she knew he was practically a helpless child. Anne plays it cool and supportive, knowing full well that Leslie's freedom means the tragic chapter of her life is officially closed and she can finally heal. Chapter 34. A literal metaphorical stork flies over Four Winds Harbor and drops off a brand new 10-pound baby boy with lungs of steel right into the little house of dreams, sending Anne into an absolute state of wholesome, teary-eyed euphoria, while Marilla and Susan hover over the newborn's tiny toes and ears. The whole squad drops by to simp over the baby, including Captain Jim, Miss Cornelia, and Leslie, who is glowing like a golden-crowned Madonna while trying to figure out her own newly uncaged life. They named the little legend James Matthew after Captain Jim and Matthew Cuthbert, sparking a hilarious conversation where Miss Cornelia recounts her childhood prayer for a brother, her severe disappointment when a baby actually arrived, and how she eventually threw hands to defend him against a school chum who called him small. Chapter 35. Anne finds Canada caught in a general election vortex, where her husband, conservative supporter Gilbert, joins local county rallies, earning strong disapproval from anti-politics Miss Cornelia, who bluntly warns Anne that men shouldn't meddle in political corruption, though Anne good-naturedly shrugs it off to admire their baby son, Little Jem, and joke about raising him as a loyal Tory. After Captain Jim dramatically drops by on the morning after the vote to announce a sweeping Liberal victory after 18 long years of Tory rule, sparking quiet amusement from Anne and utter unconcern from Susan, who only cares about getting rain for the garden and tender meat for dinner. Anne takes her very first walk down to the lighthouse to grab fish, leaving Little Jem with calm Susan. There, Anne meets a handsome, clean-shaven, middle-aged stranger whom she treats rather frostily, out of sheer annoyance at his boldness, only for Captain Jim to reveal after the man leaves that he was actually Marshall Elliott, who famously forced a sleeping, protesting Tory barber out of bed at midnight after the election to shave off his notorious decades-old beard in celebration. Captain Jim then shares a poignant, beautiful moment looking out over the Gulf at the sunset, talking wistfully of lost Margaret and his eventual voyage across uncharted seas, and tearfully asks Anne to look after his beloved feline companion, first mate, and Little Jem when his time finally comes. Chapter 36. Anne receives a letter from Marilla detailing mundane village life, including Jake Donnell's new career as a carpenter, finally escaping his mother's pretentious dream of him becoming a college professor, while Gilbert and Anne reminisce about old school days and young romances like Dora and Ralph Andrews. Leslie then shares news from George Moore, who is happily returning home to marry his steadfast childhood sweetheart after discovering she never married during his 12-year absence, a wholesome outcome that makes Anne feel deeply vindicated for originally opposing the chaotic medical intervention. Susan soon announces she must temporarily leave the little house to care for her sister Matilda, who has uncharacteristically broken a leg, prompting Leslie to joyfully move in with Anne and Gilbert to escape her lonely house. This setup delights Miss Cornelia, who notes it is the absolute ideal arrangement for Owen Ford to court Leslie safely away from the gossiping cats at the Glen. One evening, Owen surprises Leslie and Anne while they are shamelessly showering baby talk adoration on little Gem, leading to a tender, emotional reunion between Owen and a blushing, overwhelmed Leslie who retreats upstairs in tears. When Anne gently coaches her through her lingering emotional walls, Leslie finally allows herself to embrace hope, readily agreeing to walk along the shore with Owen the next day. Chapter 37. Miss Cornelia saunters into the little house, acting totally uncharacteristically quiet and weirdly idle, leaving Anne and Gilbert completely flabbergasted when she casually drops the massive plot twist that she is getting engaged to marry the newly clean-shaven local liberal giant Marshall Elliott, despite hating grit politics and joking that she could have had him 20 years ago if she hadn't wanted to avoid a walking haystack. After Gilbert teases her about Marshall's stubbornness and fiery temper, Miss Cornelia fires back that she'll make him move into her house to escape her terrible, cream-spilling hired man Jimmy Hastings, proving that her legendary sharp-tongued independence is completely unshakable as she finalizes plans for her upcoming navy blue wedding dress. Chapter 38. Owen Ford and Leslie wander through the red rose-filled garden of the little house as August winds down, where Owen waxes poetic about phantom perfumes and soul ghosts before presenting Leslie with glowing crimson buds to symbolize love triumphant, prompting a deeply emotional mutual confession of love and sealed betrothal. Shortly after, Captain Jim drops by the living room to look into a driftwood fire and shares a haunting, beautiful premonition of future happiness before bidding everyone a distinctly wistful farewell as he walks back to the lighthouse alone. Susan returns home from nursing her endlessly talkative sister Matilda, dramatically dropping news about village gossip, while Leslie privately confesses to Anne that her immense happiness feels terrifyingly fragile, until Anne reassures her that she is safe and loved under their roof. Chapter 39. Owen Ford's published book, The Life Book of Captain Jim, finally arrives from the Glen post office, and the girls eagerly race down to the lighthouse to hand the gorgeous green and gold volume to Captain Jim, who is reduced to reverent, tearful joy upon seeing his own face and life story immortalized in print. The next morning, Gilbert notices the lighthouse lamp is still burning long after sunrise, prompting a frantic rush down to the point where he and Anne discover the old captain peacefully passed away on his sofa, with his hands gently resting over the open final pages of his book, having quietly sailed out across the sunrise sea to finally reunite with lost Margaret. Chapter 40. After Captain Jim gets a deeply tacky monument from his relatives that he would have totally roasted, his legendary status lives on through his best-selling book. Though Leslie low-keys mourning that he didn't live to see the hype, while Anne logic checks her by noting the old captain was totally satisfied just getting to read it before he passed. The iconic lighthouse star keeps flashing with a fresh substitute keeper warming the seat, and Captain Jim's beloved cat, First Mate, officially moves into the little house where Susan, unapologetically anti-cat, threatens to whack the poor feline with a poker if he tries to suck the breath out of baby Gem, prompting a hilarious catastrophe pun from Gilbert. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall Elliott are out here living their best newlywed life in the greenhouse, and Leslie is busy sewing away for her upcoming Christmas wedding to Owen Ford. Seeing the writing on the wall that the little house is getting totally cramped for a growing family and doctor's office, Gilbert drops the massive plot twist that they should buy the spacious, historic Morgan Place up in the Glen. Anne goes through an absolute emotional breakdown at the thought of leaving her beloved dream house, sobbing over everything from the crooked pantry door to the red sandstone step, and low-key spiraling about some random shiftless tribe moving in to trash her gorgeous garden. Susan is totally thrilled about the upgrade for the cellars and pantries, while Leslie validates Anne's tears before dropping the ultimate plot twist redemption. Owen is buying the little house from the church trustees so they can keep it as a dreamy summer vacation spot. Finally, on a crisp October morning, the squad packs up and relocates to the Glen, leaving Anne to share one last heartbreaking, tear-filled goodbye, where she kisses the worn threshold and whispers her final farewell to the little house of dreams as the lighthouse star blinks away in the north.